Hello. I want to talk about the change in, well, I don't know if I can call it Christianity, but the change over time that has occurred within the Christian church, um, as opposed to what happened in the early days when somebody would meet the apostles or the early teachers in the church, then they would become actually very inspired by freedom. The freedom, moral freedom, they could choose. That's actually what they thought that the fall of man was teaching humanity. And therefore, because Jesus had overcome death, right, this was part of the teaching, then the early followers of Jesus felt that they were no longer obliged to follow the social order. In other words, a slave was just as valuable as a master. They didn't feel obliged to follow the traditions of the society. The girls didn't feel obliged to get married and then have their lives determined that way for the rest of their life. They were radical. They were pretty radical in how they lived, and they were willing to die for their beliefs. They refused to worship the emperor because Christianity or the early church taught them they didn't have to. There was a higher power. And then, throughout all the centuries since that time, we've seen monks and nuns who will renounce their life and follow vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But Christianity itself has become a doctrinal religion, right? You have to believe a certain doctrine. So how did that happen? Well, okay, so the first thing is that we have to acknowledge that even the idea of freedom and equality and not needing to follow your social obligations and so on, even that was actually changed by some of the early teachers, most particularly around the year 400 by Augustine, who said that man lost his moral freedom through the fall of man. Okay, therefore, humans need to be ruled. We need to be ruled because we are not able anymore to overcome original sin on our own. And this was pretty drastic teaching at the time. But it became basically the orientation of the whole church. And we'll see how that affected things sort of later on in the 17th century, especially when people started to think and question and move forward and begin with ideas of science and try to understand the world, which they had not done before. But to understand how this came about, we have to look at how the early church is embedded in, it's surrounded by Greek philosophy, it's surrounded by Romans, it's surrounded by pagan thinking. So early church thinking essentially was in the hands of the bishops, the early bishops, and so they would have been influenced by this. Some people think that actually even Plato was influenced by the Hebrew religion, the monotheism of the Hebrews being the Jews, right? So the Hebrews were the spiritual people with the one God, one creator God, as opposed to the pagans who had many gods. So the religion then emerges in a much wider sort of socialization there. Right? Lots of different opinions. And the Jewish people were not in charge, definitely. But they felt themselves to be very special. So that sort of, in a way, I guess Christianity comes and they feel like, Jesus is actually very threatening to them. So from Jesus, we don't really get theology, by the way, right? We do in a way. We get the first three Gospels, Matthew, Luke, and Mark. Matthew and Luke are basically talking about Jesus' life and teaching. There's quite a bit more theology and mystical stuff in the Gospel of John. And so we'll look into that maybe at some point, at what time was that written and so on. So, but when as the church becomes more established, then we find the early bishops, Clement, Athanasius, Tertullian, he wasn't a bishop, but he was a writer, and so on. Now they're having to deal with actual church teaching. What is the church teaching, right? So, for instance, the Trinity. What is the Trinity? So, they will come up with certain things as the Son is of one substance with the Father. Okay, so certain statements get accepted. But if you think about it, this is 2,000 years ago. What does it mean of one substance with the Father, right? In what sense is Jesus divine? This is what they're grappling with. But to us, the question of one substance with the Father is a question, right? We think about that differently because we're coming on the foundation of science. So we have a sense of what is substance now. And so I would say for the last 300-400 years, then, especially the West has really been asking questions that were not asked for maybe a millennium. And at the time, were not even allowed to be questioned. So if you were teaching something that wasn't accepted, then you were kicked out of the church, right? So everybody sort of had their own way of seeing things, like the Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. There must have been many, many, many different ways of seeing that. There was, for instance, the heresy of Docetism. And this teaching was that, well, Jesus actually wasn't a man. So he was God. So everything that Jesus did was sort of an illusion because it was God. And so Jesus' suffering on the cross wasn't actual suffering. It was just an illusion. So you can see why that would, you can see pretty easily why that would be treated as heresy. Because it took a lot away, I would say. It took a lot away from Jesus and took a lot away from the meaning of Jesus' life. But still then there's going to be a lot of questions of just what was the manner of Jesus' resurrection? Did a dead body come to life? How could that be? And if he came to life, then where is he? Does he live somewhere? So then you get the Apostles' Creed. Over time, you have to come up with like a statement of beliefs. And there's a certain way that you have to believe in the Christian church. So it is a certain doctrine. And this doctrine has to be worked out. As Christianity becomes more and more accepted, especially when it becomes the religion of the Roman Empire, then they start to have these councils and they start to discuss, well, this is what we believe and this is what every Christian has to believe in the future. Because remember the idea of original sin, that man is not able to think for himself, right? So therefore he has to be told what he believes and he has to believe that and he has to be able to enunciate what he believes. So the Trinity is not the only issue. It's the biggest issue, I would say. What is the relationship between God and Jesus and then the Holy Spirit? What is the Holy Spirit? So people believed in the Holy Spirit because at Pentecost then the apostles got together and there was they had this incredible spiritual experience. So how can you have a spiritual experience? So the idea is that the Holy Spirit is always with us, right? There will always be access to something spiritual. But what does that mean? So again, we have different teachings, right? And so these things were not questioned at that time and were not questioned for a long time afterwards. Then there's also, Jesus' teaching of, I will come again. In other words, Jesus is saying he is going to come again. So there is a teaching of the second coming. What does that mean? There's a teaching of the apocalypse. Many, many people think that we are living in apocalyptic times, the end of the world, and that the second coming will happen now. Honestly, I don't see Christian nationalism teaching that very much. Christian nationalism tends to see Christianity as a religion of just, following certain morals. And I mean, that was maybe the teaching of one or two of the early bishops too. I think Clement, for instance, focused on Christianity as like a list of morals, how you should behave. But then there were all these other questions that were not addressed because people didn't think in that way. So when we actually see the beginning of science, say in the 17th century when things were sort of really drastically changed, then a lot of the questions actually focused on original sin. What was lost through the Garden of Eden, right? So many people thought that Adam was like, before the fall of man, then Adam was this incredible being who knew everything, who could name the animals, and that was seen as something more than just giving them a name, but actually understanding all about them, knowing everything, and that after the fall of man, then all that knowledge was lost. So this sort of idea is something that turns up every now and again throughout history, right? So initially, people thought that the fall of man, they took it literally, that there was actual fall of Adam and Eve from a position of perfection, or I guess infinite knowledge in Adam's case, not Eve. So, and that after that, then humanity was just not able to perceive the truth. But many, through much of Christian history, then it has been interpreted more as a myth. But this sort of changes. So again, in the 17th century, when we have Calvin and we have the emergence of Protestantism, then this starts to bring up this question. What do we trust in? What are we allowed to question? What is the extent of man's knowledge? So a lot of science, the scientific principles, especially like in experiments, for instance, were specifically designed that there could be no way that we could be deceived, right? Because it was considered that fallen man had a very hard time perceiving the truth. So that is why the scientific method is so very focused on getting an unquestionable answer out of the experiments. So the early bishops were the ones who really came up with the answers. But then over time, of course, there were many other theologians. This whole question of original sin. St. Francis says, why original sin? Why not original innocence? Right, let's focus on original innocence for a while. So there were theologians, basically all of them were men. There were very few women whose writings we still appreciate. Julian of Norwich, Hildegard of Bingen, I think it is. So there were very few women theologians. But basically, over time, when they would teach their doctrine, then it would be in line with whatever was understood sort of generally at the time, because those were the only questions you could ask, really. So today we may have much different questions about the Trinity. We may have different questions about the second coming, right? Can we believe that? We also have different questions about the resurrection of Jesus. And whereas Christianity doesn't really let you ask those questions, now we're going to. Christianity no longer has the power to dominate our minds by telling us we're so sinful that we can't ask certain questions. And we have to follow along with the theology and the doctrine in order to be saved. But Jesus did not start that doctrine, right? He did not teach the doctrine that we believe. He didn't teach about the Trinity. He said, if you see me, you have seen the Father. But today we might understand that as quite, in quite a different fashion. I mean, there are many actual people who feel that they are the expression of divinity because we were created by the divine, right? That is quite a common thinking right now. But at that time, you couldn't claim that without being at least excommunicated by the church, if not tortured, right? You can't go around saying that you're divine or you're God. So the Gnostics actually did do that sort of thing, right? They did see the fall of man as a myth or as something symbolic. They could see like the different natures of humans were expressed in Adam and in Eve. And when Eve fell and dominated Adam, then things got turned upside down. So the Gnostic teaching focused much more on the feminine, the power of the feminine, that the feminine should be equal with the masculine. And that was not accepted, not acceptable. But what they were asking were questions that we are now asking on a different level. So it's not enough in Christianity just to say, the Gnostics were evil. We can't say that anymore because we have different questions and we are coming on a different knowledge base today. So we shouldn't see questioning today in the same way as we did back then, at Jesus' time. It's something that we have to do. We have to ask, what is the meaning of the resurrection? Does everybody get resurrected? If you get resurrected, do you go live somewhere else? Is there a whole spiritual world that we all live in? Or do we exist sort of like in the mind of God only, and we don't have any sort of individual identity anymore? Even in the Bible it says it was sown a physical body, it was raised a spiritual body. What is this spiritual body? Okay? So when let's say we're going to another place to be in heaven or whatever, we'll call it a spiritual realm. Are we going to get a theological test when we go there? No, probably not, right? I can't really see that Jesus is going to be totally focused on doctrine. But Jesus may be focused on, what sort of spiritual level are we at? The last video I made talked about spiritual growth. Did we not even reach stage 2? Are we still stuck in chaos where we have no beliefs and no principles? That is a problem if you die at that stage. But again, that's my belief. I can't say for sure. But I can't see that it's going to do you any good to go to any sort of spiritual world if you are stuck in a chaotic reality in your own self. All right, anyway, we're going to move on and we're going to understand a lot more and we're going to ask a lot more questions. So thank you for listening.